Welcome back to lesson number 8. I'm Steve Jarrard. I'm your host of this Bible study. The subject, of course, as you know by now, if you haven't figured it out, is the return of Jesus Christ. We've been discussing the heptadic, the sabbatical pattern. I've left the timeline up here on the board. I've made a few additions to take into account some other scripture. There are some ancient Jewish writings, commentary is what they are, called the Midrash, and some other writings as well that were developed after Christ, and they view the Old Testament stories, the Old Testament itself, both as prophecy and as a theme to be repeated. I talked to you a little bit in our first series on this subject here about the patterns being repetitive, and that is the way that the Jewish theologians of old understood the Old Testament, that these themes would be repeated and developed to its final cosmic fulfillment in the future. And that God would be working out His plan for 6 days, followed by a cessation of work, referred to today as a day of rest. Now the key that we shared with you in our last series was 2 Peter 3 verse 8, that with the Lord, 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. There's an ancient Jewish theologian by the name of Maimonides. He's also known affectionately by the Jewish community as Rambam, and he lived from 1194 to 1270. And in his writings, he conjectures that for 6,000 years of man's rule on earth, followed by 1,000 years of God's rule on earth. And in other writings, which I'll probably only quote from one, in a better setting where we have more time, I'd go into the others, and it needs a little bit of an explanation. There's a book that's not in our canonized Bible called the Book of Enoch. I'm sure most of you have heard of it. If you don't have a copy, I recommend you get a copy. Now, I'm going to quote from the Book of Enoch, and why would I do that? Well, I'm going to give you the short answer. I'll go into it more in depth, if I'm meeting with you one-on-one as a group. But Jude, who was the half-brother of Jesus Christ, only one chapter, he quotes from the prophet Enoch. Now, he was led by inspiration of the Holy Spirit to draw and excerpt a quote from the book, which existed for centuries before Christ and was taught and read in the Jewish synagogues, and it was possessed and owned by Christians for centuries after Christ, the Book of Enoch, and it was read and studied along with all the letters that we now know as the New Testament. So that's a short story. In Enoch chapter 33, verse 1, and then even if you don't ascribe the Book of Enoch to be an inspired book, if you consider it to be apocryphal, which it certainly it falls into that category, regardless, there's much information in the book that we can do well to read and study today. And I'll just make a little sidebar, a little side note. In the Qumran caves, when all these ancient manuscripts were discovered just outside of Israel, there were more books of the Book of Enoch than any other of the writings. Chapter 33, verse 1, Enoch writes, and I appointed the 8th day also, that the 8th day should be the first created after my work, and that the first 7 revolve in the form of the 7,000, and that at the beginning of the 8,000 there should be a time of not counting, endless with neither years, nor months, nor weeks, nor days, nor hours. Also in some of the Jewish early scriptural interpretations of the Mishnah, and later commentary on them in what's called the Gemara, the book of the Jewish law, there's instruction from the Talmud in what's called the Tractate Avodah Zarah on page 9, which states that this world as we know it will only exist for 6,000 years beginning with Adam. And in addition, it says specifically the world will stand for 6,000 years. There will be 2,000 years of confusion, 2,000 years under the law, and 2,000 years of the time of the Messiah. Now there's also an ancient rabbinic teaching of old that said, quote, "Cursed are the bones of him who calculates the time of the end." Well, I certainly don't want anybody's bones to be cursed, but that's the way the Jews perceived. And you know what's interesting is that today in Jerusalem, if you visit or if you are read up on messianic fervor, there's a great messianic longing right now for the return of Messiah that's accompanied everything since 1948 that's happened up until now. Jews are looking under every rock for Messiah. They believe that his return is imminent, and there was even a rabbi who ended up dying. I've got his name someplace in my notes here. I'll probably not get to it, but it was believed that he was the Christ, and he lived to a ripe old age of about 96, and he passed away about a decade ago. But here's part of the problem with the Jewish people right now. Even though they are anticipating, looking for the return of Messiah, first coming of Messiah, you understand. They don't believe Jesus was Messiah 2,000 years ago. The Jewish people have a problem with their calendar. They understand from the ancient writings that after 6,000 years Messiah would come. That's the way they understood it. It's the way they understand it today. But the problem comes with their calendar, which does not coincide very well with our calendar, and particularly the timeline that the Irish prelate Usher worked out for us, that we now identify and use today in our studies. Their calendar, as of 2010, which was just last year, we're January now of 2011, was 5,770 years. And as of the year 2000, September 30th, 2000, their calendar clicked over at 5,761. So they are several hundred years off of our calendar, our Gregorian calendar that we use today. However, if you want to do the study, you can make up for the correction, because actually, in actuality, the Jewish calendar is off by several hundred years. Now, the first mistake was back in about the 3rd century BC, 2nd, 3rd century BC, when the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, called the Septuagint. In the genealogies, in the opening chapters of Genesis, there was a clerical mistake, a difference of 166 years. There was a second mistake. Well, let's see, have I got this right? No. Of actually 73 years. A clerical mistake in the translation to the Septuagint, 73 years. There's another discrepancy of 166 years between the time of the destruction of the first temple and the second temple. And you can go online. I'm giving you the website so you can do your own study and research on that. It's www.answeringenesis.org. ANSWERINGENESIS.org. And they lay it out. There's also, you can go to another website. I don't have the address. I'm trying to think of his name right now. I can't think of it right off the top of my head. When it comes to me, I'll give you his website and Chuck Missler's website, Koinonia House. And he discusses this too, and he's quite a scholar. He's a very biblical, educated man when it comes to things of this matter. Now there's a difference, a total of 239 years, and when you add your 239 to make the corrections to the Jewish calendar for the year 2000 of 5761, lo and behold, we have 6,000 years. Whoa, imagine that. So making up for the errors of the Jewish calendar, we're both the Jewish understanding and the corrected Jewish understanding and the more modern understanding that of the year 2000 was 6,000 years from Adam. Now, counting from the cross from Jesus, day 1, day 2, day 3. Hosea chapter 6, verse 2. Hosea writes, "He will revive us after 2 days. He will raise us up on the 3rd day, that we may live before Him." This is language that tells us when we, not talking about Jesus, but he's talking about God's people, will live and be raised up. It'll be after 2 days, and it'll be on the 3rd day. Now, Jesus was raised on the 3rd day, and what you need to remember, you go back and you check these verses out, early on the morning of the 1st day of the week, which was 3 days. Jesus said, 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the big fish, so shall the Son of Man be in the earth. After 3 days, early on the morning of the 3rd day, on Sunday morning, when the women got up, it was still dark. And by the time they got to the tomb, you know, I'm a deer hunter, so I'm always looking for that first light when it's legal to shoot a deer. Bad analogy here, but the women got there. There was sunshine. It was up, but it was just barely cresting over the top of the horizon. And so Jesus rose early on the morning of the 3rd day, which of course was Sunday, the 1st day of the week. Another story. So we're going to pick up our next study here with the Jewish calendar. And we're going to go back into history to the early church and see what the early church believed and taught, and see how that teaching and understanding was perverted over a period of time. Thank you for your attention.